Good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum to those joining us on Zoom. My name is Ray Sunby, president of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular and reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not yet done so. Membership forms are available on our website at humanists.org. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue to listen to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website, humanists.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate to our organization on our website, www.humanists.org.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Where am I? Yes, my name is Alex Havasi. I'm vice president of the Humanist community. At today's forum, Scott Wakefield will talk about how identity causes problems in our society.
Okay, hello. I'm ready for sharing the screen for my slides. I'm going to talk about identity. So this came up. Suppose you're talking to someone. And you're discussing something, and they'll say something to you, and then you try to point out some reasons why they might want to change their mind, and they might say something else, and you get the feeling that it's coming from some group that they identify with, and how do you deal with that? So that's kind of how this talk started. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's what I just said. So next slide, please. And I was gonna have y'all guess where I got this, but I'm just gonna tell you, it's ChatGPT. So the first 5 slides are artificially intelligent. If you find yourself, so this is again what I said, if you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to reason with someone who seems to be regurgitating talking points or beliefs from their group, without engaging in genuine dialogue or considering alternate perspectives, there are a few things you can do. Next slide, please. So the first is, don't dismiss them out of hand. Try to, just acknowledge. Just say, okay, I hear you. Start by acknowledging their point of view, even if you disagree with it. This can help to establish a rapport and reduce defensiveness. Next slide, please. Second, try to ask open-ended questions to encourage the other person to explain their views in more detail. This can help you to better understand their perspective and identify areas of common ground. I think this is a big one. I mean, no matter who you're talking with, there's got to be something that you both agree on. Next slide, please. Share your own perspective, be clear about your reasoning, but avoid being confrontational. So there's a theme here in my little presentation. Avoid being dismissive of the other person's views. Slide, please. And here's something that you do have control over, kind of, sort of. Try to avoid getting defensive. If the other person responds with more talking points or group beliefs, avoid becoming defensive or dismissive, and try to stay calm and focused on the discussion at hand. I said we have control over this, but it's easier said than done, I know. Next slide, please. Take a break if needed, if the conversation becomes too heated or unproductive. And for me, sometimes this taking a break might be for the rest of my life. I don't ever want to talk to that person again. But see what you can do. It may be helpful to take a break and revisit the discussion at a later time when emotions have cooled. And in conclusion, the next slide. Remember that changing someone's deeply held beliefs can be difficult, and it may not be possible to convince them to see things differently in a single conversation. However, by engaging in a respectful and thoughtful dialogue, you may be able to plant the seeds of doubt or encourage them to consider alternative perspectives. So this is a long-term project. Next slide, please. So I want to talk now about just influence in general. And so some of this is a little bit of an overlap with other slides. There's so many different ways to look at this. And so you'll see some things, peer pressure, that's going to show up over and over again. All right, so let's just talk about some ways that the person you're talking to, or we ourselves, how we change our minds from our social environment. So we conform, we might want to conform, which is to match the norms of the group we identify with. Socialize, which is when you're in the group and they have views, and then you take that view in, you adopt it as your personal, part of your personal worldview. And then the next two I've divided up into horizontal and vertical effects. Peer pressure. So you might recognize that the people around you, the people that are your friends, your views don't exactly align. And so you might adopt these views unwillingly, but you want to stay friends with the people in your group. And then there's this vertical kind of influence where someone above you, that's why I'm calling it vertical, an authority figure, and you yield to that person. So we call that obeying. Leading is kind of what we're talking about here, right? It's where you want to guide people, to influence them, and persuade. I think that's another word for the same kind of thing. And then there's marketing and selling. Marketing being when you're trying to make people aware of something that you're trying to promote, and so that might someone who gets wind of that might become a lead. And so then sales would be when you're trying to convert the lead into a buyer. Next slide. And a lot of times we just have a presentation and there'll be Q&A at the end, and we'll do that again today. But please feel free to, if something here moves you. So I thought this was interesting. We can talk about ways that social influence happens, something called compliance, when publicly you are showing the world that you agree with something, but in private, you maybe not so much. And then when you internalize something, which is something we saw on the previous slide, that's where, again, you're showing to the world that you have a particular view, but actually in your private, it's in agreement. These are congruent. So you truly do believe something, that's internalizing it. And then getting back to the title, identity, there's someone that you like and respect, and so you can identify with them. And next slide, for example, a public figure. Now there's two ways to think about your why you would want to conform. You might have a need to be right. So this is, you might be influenced in what we will call informational social influence. And there's this term called social proof. I don't know where that term comes from, which is another way of talking about this kind of informational social influence. And so that means that you have accepted something, an idea. And what you're taking the information from the people around you. And this becomes particularly important when people are uncertain or under stress. You know, something's happened, something new, and you don't quite know what to think. You may take your cue from people around you. There's a different kind of conformity that they call normative social influence, which comes from your need to be liked. Next slide. So here's some examples of that social proof. Maybe you've seen this if you're at the bar and you're having a drink, and you can see there's a jar on the bar for tips. And the bartender may, put some money in there before any other people have come in. Why would they do that? It's so that other people come in and they say, oh, look, I see other people are giving tips to the bartender. So it makes you more likely. Similar, if you're at church and they're passing the collection basket on Sunday morning, if the church usher may just put something in there to give you an example. And then when it comes to you, you say, oh, other people have donated, I should donate too. If you're an evangelical preacher, you may arrange for a ringer to give witness and donate. And I thought this was interesting. I heard about an account that Billy Graham, I don't know if he still does this. In the old days, he used to travel around. I guess he's gone now. Now it's his, yeah. But what they would do is they would have an advance crew come and they would collect people and get them to come forth at the altar call. And at one of these, they might have thousands of people. Next slide. So that's social proof. There's this concept of social contagion. You can have a behavior spread through a group. That would be a behavioral contagion. You can have an emotion spread through a group. That would be an emotional contagion. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, here's a funny thing. You might find someone who's under pressure to accept a view, but they adopt the opposite view. And there might be a couple reasons for that. It might be that they see that as being a threat to their freedoms. And even if, the view that they're rejecting is clearly correct, they may still reject it. And so that's called anti-conformity or reactance.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can you actually cite any examples of this kind of anti-conformity? It seems kind of odd.
Yeah. That's a good, okay, if I have to give this up a third time, I'll look something up. But something that comes to mind is in the United Kingdom, they have a term that I don't hear often here, and it's called being bloody-minded. And it's when, even if it hurts yourself, I'm going to assert my independence. I'm not sure.
Brexit.
Yes, sir.
Recently a teenager, I can share. I knew a lot of people that adopted contrarian views to authority figures, not because they necessarily thought they were correct, but because they really, really wanted to object to the people giving the views, whether it be teachers or parents.
Oh, there's an example. Teenagers.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, I used to have a friend, he just used to like to argue and he would just switch to the other side just for the fun of it.
Okay, thanks for those examples. So here's 3 experiments that perhaps you've heard of it. The first one is called Milgram. It's shocking. Sorry. So here's what they would do. You ask for volunteers. People would come in and you would say to them, okay, this experiment has to do with learning. So you are going to be a teacher and we're going to bring in a student and, when they make a mistake, you push this button and it administers a shock to the learner. Now it's all a sham, but the subject who's being asked to be the teacher, they don't know that. And they wanted to know, how much will people obey? And the shocking thing about it was that people would obey. And they had the learner pretend to be in agony when they would administer the shock. And these people just kept doing it. Sometimes they would say, are you sure this is okay? And the person running the experiment would say, yes, you must obey. And they did. That's the Milgram experiment. There was an experiment having to do with nurses in a hospital. And just as an experiment, and it wasn't real, the doses weren't actually dangerous, but subjects didn't know that. These nurses were told, here's the doctor's orders, administer this dose, and they would obey. They responded to the authority. And just locally here, the local Leland Stanford Junior University had an experiment where they divided up the class, and they said, okay, you guys are going to pretend to be prisoners, and you guys are going to pretend to be guards. And the guards took it both groups took it so seriously, they had to stop the experiment. It got so extreme. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide, please. Yes, sir.
This has important real world effects. In the latest train accident in Greece, one of the train operators said, but there's a red light saying I shouldn't go forward. He was instructed to carry on despite the red light. Turns out the red light was real and he should not have. So this is not just theoretical.
Didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, earlier I had said that some of these ideas were going to show up again and again. There's different people who write about these things. So some of these you may have heard about earlier in this talk. Weapons of influence to persuade, reciprocity. I mean, we see this all the time, right? You'd get a solicitation in the mail asking for a donation to a charity. And you might find inside there, they've got some return address labels. And that can increase how much the percentage of people who respond with a donation, it can triple it. Commitment and consistency. If you take one step, then you become averse to change. So in an experiment, an example of this is in a community, you might go door to door and you say, would you please just post this small 6-inch sign in your window that says, please drive slowly, or something like that. And then you come back later and you say, okay, now would you put this yard sign in front of your house that says, please drive slowly. And if people have taken the first step, then, their own view of themselves, they see themselves as someone who's interested in traffic safety. So they're more likely to accept your suggestion for a bigger request. And we already talked about informational social influence, social proof. When you see others do it, you're more likely to do it yourself. We talked about those authority experiments. That's a kind of way of persuading people, liking if there's someone that you identify with. And if something is perceived as being scarce, then that generates demand. Okay. These, as I say, this is slicing and dicing in different order. So if we get the slides out of order, it's okay. I couldn't figure out the correct order to present these things in. So, I mean, now it's like surely there's a different extent. I mean, there's persuasion and then there's manipulation. And I'm going to just say that there's two kinds. One is where you accept that the person you're trying to persuade has the right to accept or reject. And so a harmless example of that is if a doctor is trying to persuade a patient to do something that would be in their own interest, for their own health. And then this other category where the manipulator wants you to do something that's in their interest and it is against your interests. So that would be abuse, being deceptive, devious, you're exploiting them, and it's underhanded. Okay. Thank you. So these more extreme ways, if you're trying to threaten or coerce someone, intimidate them, if you're abusing them emotionally, and this is something that I just saw in the news this week about people talking about what do they call it in a prison where they have to be by themselves? And that can have that can actually be damaging. Next slide, please. Okay, here's one I like: propaganda. If you're persuading someone, you can say, "Well, I'll mention these facts, but not those." And another way is to try to play on their emotions. And I like this example. This is a painting by Norman Rockwell from during World War II, entitled "Freedom of Speech." And here you can see this gentleman is holding a document, and it says report, and he's got a copy of it clearly in his pocket. And so the folks all around the person standing up, they're all wearing suits and ties. And this guy's wearing a worn bomber jacket. And so isn't there an emotional response to that? Freedom of speech. I like that.
It's
So,
interesting, there's all men in that. Like would you repeat it?
oh, all the characters in that painting were men. There, if you look closely, there is one,
Yeah.
you just see her eye.
Having attended many town hall meetings in Vermont, they're not all men, and they're not all wearing suits. So that's a highly propagandized painting.
Well, it was, styles changed. That was from what, 80 years ago or something. Okay. So how much you get influenced by your group might depend on how important the group is to you. And if you've interacted with them recently and they're close to you, in distance physically, and if the group is larger, that might include how much influence it has on you. And if you perceive that the opinion is unanimous, that can influence you also. So I talked about the experiment where people were told to what they thought would be shocking people. They had a variation on that experiment where now this subject, the so-called teacher, there's multiple teachers, and the other teachers are actually confederates of the experimenter. And if everyone is doing what the authority tells them to do, then you are more likely to do it. But if one of those other teachers disobeys, then you're more likely. Oh, here we have the numbers. So if you're the only teacher, 65% went all the way. The maximum shock was 450 volts. But if one of the other teachers stepped out of line, then only 10% followed through to the maximum shock.
As I recall on that experiment, the highest voltage was labeled dangerous, do not do this. And so that was an additional warning on the instrument.
Yeah. Now there's something called confirmation bias.
This is Jerry. Can I say something about
Oh,
that
please.
last? Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. There was experiments where they would do something like they'd have a short line and a long line and ask what the answer was. And the Confederates all said the short line was longer. So this other guy's looking at it, he can see that the short one is shorter, but he still says it's longer. To me, that's a little more extreme than the Milgram experiment. That's all.
Right.
And also, all of these experiments, I would posit, suffer from self-selection bias. If you're a student in the 1960s and you're a beatnik and you read Jack Kerouac, you're not in this experiment. You would not show up. So people who show up already have a tendency to be obedient to authority. So
Right.
these experiments are not, I think, representative of the population at large. That's my 2 cents.
I think they try to account for that. They try to, I don't know. You're right. But I think it's a good as an illustration. I mean, I think of these things and I see people in my everyday life. And I see it in myself. by the way. So there's something called confirmation bias, that once you believe something, it's hard to change your mind. You kind of get stuck in a rut. So if you're looking for more information, your search will be biased to only search for things that confirm what you already believe. And if you find information, your interpretation of it will be colored by what you already believe. And I'm so disappointed in my memory. If I'm trying to remember something that happened, my memory will be biased. I'm more likely to remember something that matches what I already believe, as opposed to something that might challenge that, all tending to confirm prior beliefs and values. Oh, some more about it. So if you believe something and you see some evidence, your response to it will depend on whether it matches, it matches what you already believe. Can we go back one slide? And that's called attitude polarization. And it's sticky. So if you believe in something and there's evidence that shows that it's false, your belief tends to hang around. If you are looking at some evidence and it might come to you in a certain order, the ones that you see first tend to be the ones that you rely on, and they have a name for that. If this is one that Las Vegas depends on. If you see things that seem to happen together, you'll say, oh, these things go together, even though that might not well be true. You need to look at more. So that's an illusory correlation. Oh my goodness. You know what? These referent, I had to look up referent. I'm going to skip this slide. This is just, next slide, please. It's kind of saying the same thing with using 25-cent words. People adopt the norms, beliefs, and behaviors of fellow in-group members, and they're calling this self-categorization theory. I think it's the same kind of thing that we've been talking about. People distance themselves from the norms, beliefs, and behaviors of out-group members. So it's being in with the in crowd. Okay, now I want to talk about something without naming it yet. So we've talked about how credibility and trust can influence the influence of people around you. If you see someone as being experienced, you perceive someone as being attractive, you perceive someone as being knowledgeable, that makes them credible to you. Also, if you're in a group, you want to agree with the group to keep your reputation and not appear fringe. Now, on top of all this, if you add a desire for group harmony, you add a desire for group conformity, and you add a desire for group cohesiveness, there's a word for all of this. Next slide, please. Can we go back one slide, please? So it comes down to a tendency to agree at all costs, a tendency to minimize conflict, and a tendency to reach a critical decision without critical evaluation. Next slide, please. So in 1948, a book came out called 1984 by George Orwell, and he actually imagined a world in which the authorities invented a whole new language, and they called it Newspeak. And one of the words in Newspeak was called doublethink. What doublethink meant was to indoctrinate someone to, at the same time, accept two conflicting beliefs as truth. And so that's where this word groupthink came from. In a few years later, in 1952, in Fortune magazine, there was an article entitled Groupthink. So what it is among the members of a cohesive policy-making group, three things: amiability, esprit de corps, and concurrence seeking become so dominant, they override realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. Now, that results in a deterioration of mental efficiency, a deterioration in reality testing, a deterioration in moral judgments, and decisions due to groupthink can lead to disaster. And I have a few examples. Before the United States entered the war, whoever does these things, I guess the predecessor of the CIA, somebody, was able to break the Japanese codes. The Japanese were talking to their military forces in code, and the United States could read them. And the United States knew that the Japanese were going to attack somewhere in the Pacific. They didn't know where. Could it have been Pearl Harbor? It could not. So the people thought, because of groupthink, and they had these ideas. The Japanese would never dare attempt a full-scale surprise assault against Hawaii because they would realize that it would precipitate an all-out war, which the United States would surely win. You know what? Not included in this, I think there was some racism involved too. We big tough white guys, we can take it. The Pacific Fleet concentrated at Pearl Harbor was a major deterrent against air or naval attack. Even if the Japanese were foolhardy enough to send their carriers to attack us, we would certainly detect and destroy them in plenty of time. No war. So the people these are what the people in Pearl Harbor were telling each other, and because of this groupthink, no warships anchored in the shallow water of Pearl Harbor could ever be sunk by torpedo bombs launched from enemy aircraft. Another disaster that came about because of groupthink. There we go. Okay. The Nazi Germany decision to invade the Soviet Union. There was some racism there also, by the way. The Bay of Pigs. The people trying to decide that, they convinced themselves that it was a good idea and was sure to be a success. Now, this third example I've listed here is kind of the opposite. I think that based on that experience, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy often would convene meetings of his advisors, and he himself would not attend. He wanted to get their more honest opinion. And the Vietnam War, the Secretary of Defense, they convinced themselves it was a good idea. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then under Nixon, his Committee for the Re-election of the President, they broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Is there a question from the audience? At the Watergate building. This became known as the Watergate scandal. And then it was covered up. And a particular campaign ad said that he was not one to stand up in a meeting and say that this should be stopped. And he said the reason he decided was the fear of the group pressure that would ensue of not being a team player. Mm-hmm. Is there a question from the audience?
Somebody turn off their mic.
Okay. In 1986, yes?
I want to add an example.
Thank you.
The decision to attack Iraq after 9/11.
Oh my goodness. That's my third bullet on the next slide. Thank you.
Oh,
that's right.
Sorry.
Yep. So I was going to talk about the Space Shuttle Challenger. Remember, that was the one that they launched when it was in the 30s degrees Fahrenheit in Florida, and there was pressure to launch because Reagan was about to give a State of the Union address, and he wanted to, say hello to the school teacher who was on board. And there was an engineer at Morton Thiokol, I think is the name of the company, and he was saying, it's cold. And someone said to him, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. There was pressure to conform. And so, as Jerry was saying, after 9/11, remember I said that you can, if you're under stress, can lead to the groupthink, really. And that led to the invasion of Iraq. In 2016, news professionals, polling professionals expected Clinton to win. The New York Times said there was an 84% chance she would win. Reuters said there was a 90% chance they would win because they couldn't imagine that such a candidate could possibly win. So here's some phrases you might hear that are indicative of groupthink. You want to fit in, you want to go along with the crowd, you have fear of rocking the boat, yes men, the hive mind in social media such as Twitter, where you're conforming to the collective. And there's an example of a communications company in which refusal of the new hires to cheer on command incurred consequences not unlike the indoctrination and brainwashing techniques associated with the Soviet-era Gulag. Crack that whip. Oh, that must be my last slide. So in conclusion, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, you know, you want to, the main thing is, you know, kind of like this bloody-mindedness that the harder you push, don't do it. That no one's going to listen to you unless they see you as your friend. So when you're talking to someone, you got to keep your cool. And it's easy to say, but that's my message to you this morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, we got a few questions here. Now, Mark.
There was the movie 12 Angry Men that put forth the opposite, where 11 men were willing to convict the guy. And one guy said, nah, I don't know, I've got some questions about this. Eventually, he swayed the rest of the jury into changing their position. It was the point of the whole movie, as I recall.
I would say
Great
that it
movie.
also features some of the opposite. If I recall, some of the jurors, or at least one of the jurors, went along because at the time, most of the other group was saying to go one way. It was an example of social pressure causing them to vote a particular way rather than being truly convinced of the man's innocence or guilt. And the movie tried to like deprogram people from that position. So
What did you say about Clooney?
I didn't say Clooney, just that the movie featured both instances of people going against group pressure and caving to it.
Yeah, it was actually complicated. Every one of the 12 had different reasons for changing their mind. And the one I remember best is the guy who just wanted to get out of there and go to a baseball game. So he switched sides when the majority went the other way.
All right, I was expecting to hear about the nature of identity itself. Is it constructed or is it innate? And if it's constructed, how? I was expecting to hear something about that.
Same question I have.
Okay, clearly there's need for another talk. We need someone to step up.
I thought, by the way, I also watched 12 Angry Men. What struck me is in the beginning, the guy who dissented didn't even say he was innocent. He just said, we should talk about this for a while rather than just vote it immediately. And the first person to go over to his side went over to him because he respected his stand. Oh, okay. And it kind of developed from there slowly. Do I have a...
Good talk. I have a question though. You mentioned about groupthink. What is the socio-political interplay during those times like Cuba invasion or Vietnam by attributing to that as a part of groupthink instead of as a interplay of the socio-political issues? I feel that those issues have been undermined. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Gosh. The thing that comes to my mind is that it's hard for someone to adopt a view that means he would lose his job.
I can,
Go ahead, Jerry.
yeah, I actually read a book called Essence of Decision by Graham Allison, where he's analyzing how governments act. And he uses the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example. And I remember things like the Army and the Marines wanted to invade, the Air Force wanted to bomb the place, and the Navy liked the idea of the blockade. And the blockade idea didn't come up until like day 5 or 6. And I think you're right. You know, Kennedy did what he did because he was his experience with the Bay of Pigs. And a different president might have gone along with one of those other efforts, and we might not be here today as a result.
You know, I've had the experience of having groups of friends who don't necessarily get along. And I've had situations where I'd be talking with one group and they'd leave and another group would come in. And I could almost feel myself changing into another person. You know, I don't think my views changed on anything, but it felt different to talk to different people.
That way. Yeah, but you can't see it because you're the window.
Oh, okay. So there. Oh, here we go. Randy?
I'd be interested in how you do or don't relate this to stereotyping. Where you just assume because of the group or whatever, or the hierarchical structure, and make assumptions about the person you're dealing with. I was taught my kids stereotypes exist for a reason, but you always judge the individual by the individual. Thank you.
I'd like to point out that Zem has been waiting for a while.
Yes, he has.
Oh, Zem.
Yeah. Scott, thanks for the interesting presentation. I thought when you talked about conversations, you were talking about very transactional situations, kind of a Dale Carnegie, you know, that I'm here to sell you aluminum siding, and how do I make the argument? How do I present it, you know, in order to convince you, right? When I think of conversations, I think of intellectual banter, where there is no agenda, right? I'm not trying to sell you something and the other person is not trying to sell me something. We simply enjoy sparring intellectually, right? And so if in such a situation, if one of the people, let's say the person I'm talking to, was just like really firm in something, you know, in some position, not willing even to entertain discussing it, I would just disengage because it would no longer be interesting to me, right? Because there the conversation is sort of the end in itself. I think all these other examples you gave are transactional, and I don't even think groupthink exists. And I'll give you an example that I think gave on some of the Zoom calls. We might be bored with it. So there are, you know, during the pandemic, there were, and probably still are, groups of anti-vaxxers, right? And there are tight-knit communities of people who don't believe in vaccinations. So one day, a guy shows up at a hospital, I believe in St. Louis, and says, "I would like to get a COVID vaccine." So the doctor says, "Great, you know, let's do it." And the guy then says, "Oh, but could you take me somewhere in the back so no one will see it?" You see, he did not give a rat's ass about the beliefs of his group. He just wanted to belong. So I think groupthink is also very transactional and very, you know, it's you know, just like the group thing, you know, about Pearl Harbor or anything else. There's one, you know, alpha male in the room that's making a decision, and I'll just go along with it. It doesn't mean I agree with it. It doesn't mean I accept either the values or the conclusions or actually anything. But it's just, you know, I want to be part of the group. I have this herd desire, right? But it doesn't mean I actually have to, you know, internalize the belief. I don't know. Also, before I go, because I'm using up so much time, when you were talking about what was it? What did you call it? Anti-conformity or
I forgot already. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually there is, I think I can think of two good reasons. One is psychological. If you are insecure, if you have a weak ego, you will defend yourself. If someone steps on it and tells you here's how things should be, you will feel threatened. You'll be attacked, That's one reason. And the other reason is actually much more logical. If you come at me with some argument and you do it in a forceful way, I will conclude that the argument must not be very good if you have to resort to this tactic. A good argument stands on its own merit. If you are shouting at me or bullying me, then okay, I just don't believe what you're trying to force something upon me, which tells me okay, I probably wouldn't believe it if I was presented with it in a more calm manner. So I think there is actually a good rationale there, or could be at least. Okay,
Makes sense to me. Yeah.
Oded.
I have some opinion. Question. Group can be monolithic or group can be mosaic. That means in group you can have different people with different opinion, and because we are ourselves have different opinion, we are not monolithic. Some people have more of the called social justice. Some of them have more entrepreneur. That means people are not monolithic and group are not monolithic. So people can feel themselves what called eligible to go into several groups that altogether represent that what this particular person believes in. But he will be foreigner for all those groups because he don't confirm with 100% of what the monolithic mostly group believe in. So I think for myself, for example, I find myself going to all kind of group because each group have the good stuff and the bad stuff, to my opinion. I don't think there's a group that is so monolithic that it can present everyone social and believe. I think I try to make it as clear as I can, but basically we are not single group people and not single mind. We are very variant in our opinion, in our emotion, and our logic even. Thank you.
Okay, Jerry.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that I think is opposed to the humanist group thing. In 2000, I was on the Nader campaign, and we had so many people tell us, no, a vote for a third party is a completely wasted vote. And so most people were going to vote Democrat or Republican as a result. I can tell you that while tabling, there were a lot of guys who came and said, I'd be willing to vote for Nader if I thought he had a chance. So many that I thought, geez, everybody voted for who they liked. Maybe he has got a chance. I could also talk to you about Bob La Follette's campaign in 1924 and how he only carried Wisconsin, but it influenced the New Deal administration because those who had supported Bob La Follette, when they met each other, they knew they could trust each other, and it helped get things done. That's it.
Okay. Ray, you had something.
So Scott, you had a slide where you were talking about influencing somebody to come to a point of view that would be beneficial to them. And you talked about somebody else trying to influence somebody to come to a point of view that would be in their own interest, not the person they're talking to.
Uh-huh.
And I don't remember the term you used, but what came to mind was a lot of political advertising is trying to encourage people to vote other than in their own interest.